I've heard before, and I promise this is not an original idea that I'm pretending to have heard elsewhere, that my friend asked me to ask sort of question, that in all sexual exchanges, there's a power exchange.
Definitely.
Maybe you could elaborate on that, because as you were describing some of the seductive power dynamics that exist, a phrase that I've heard before came to mind that at first made me chuckle, but then made me think quite deeply about this issue of the relationship between sexual and power dynamics, which is this notion of topping from the bottom. You know, if one is giving someone else that they are more powerful, by virtue of the word giving, they actually hold some power, right? Power can be given or taken, but oftentimes seductive exchanges and sexual exchanges and romantic exchanges in particular are both people buying into a temporary illusion. Let's pretend that you're in charge when actually I'm in charge. Okay, but I know that you think that you're in charge. Okay, let's just pretend none of that exists and just do X, right? And I think this is another example of covert contracts. And it's one that actually can potentially create a lot of problems post hoc, right? But I think the relationship between sex, romance, and power is an important area to explore in the context of this.
Well, I wrote The Art of Seduction with the idea that it was an art invented by women. It was invented by women who had no power, essentially, socially, politically, in any sense of the word, in domestically, right? But the one power that they could wield over a man was through sex, some physical attraction. And so they developed this art of kind of luring a man into their world through various theatrical effects, Cleopatra being kind of the archetype of this, and then luring the powerful man into this world. He has the illusion that he's the one pursuing her, but in fact, she is the one controlling the dynamic. So oftentimes the person who appears to be the weaker one in the relationship, who's not doing the pursuing, is actually inviting the pursuing, is actually leading the other person on. So there's a lot of kind of appearance games going on, and you can never really figure out who exactly is in control of the dynamic, because one person is like allowing the other person to lead them on, but the fact that you're allowing them is a degree of power, is a degree of control, right? So it's very hard to figure out, and sex and power and romantic relationships are very much intertwined in us, physically, emotionally, neurologically. You can't avoid it, right? And so I think it's kind of dishonest to say that none of that exists, that it's like that there's some egalitarian paradise out of there, when it's really not wired in us for that kind of relationship.
There's a recent scientific publication / factoid that I wanted to share with you in this context, because I'd like your thoughts on it. David Anderson, who's a phenomenal neurobiologist, he's been a guest on this podcast before. He's a professor at Caltech, studies basically the functions of the hypothalamus. So the things like aggression, mating, and things of that sort, and does it with great detail. He's a virtuoso of the hypothalamus. And he published a paper 2 years ago showing that indeed there are neural circuits in the brain of animals, and presumably in humans as well, that control sexual mounting behavior, but that there is actually a separate circuit for purely non-sexual mounting and physical power over that's expressed in animals. And anyone that's ever owned a dog and gone to the dog park will see same-sex mounting between dogs, or mounting between dogs that has apparently no sexual endpoint.
Yeah.
And in exploring this literature and talking to David about it, it's very clear that there are neural circuits that have everything to do with essentially one animal of a species getting on top of the other animal, usually from behind, oftentimes scruffing or biting the back of the neck, and saying, I control you. It's often done in a playful context, especially between animals, not always aggressive, but there's a certain element of aggressive to it. But it essentially says, I decide whether or not you are mobile or not for this moment. And and this is very important, I want to emphasize this is a circuit that is entirely separate from all of the reflexes associated with sexual behavior in males and females. I find this to be fascinating, and because we hear about power over, right? And we hear about power and we think about physical power over, but the idea that something as primitive as mounting, just like something as primitive as biting or as striking, has its own unique set of circuits in the brain, I think substantiates everything that you put in your books about power and maybe even seduction as well. So as I just kind of toss that out there for consideration, I wonder if you have any reflections on it. If not, feel free to just say, I don't, but of course. But to me, this was a really important discovery because I think everyone looks at mounting behavior and says that has to be sexual. And sometimes it's...
I see what you mean.
But it's not. That there seem to be a host of neural circuits in the brain that are really about defining who's on top, literally, that has nothing to do with sex.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I've never read anything about that, but I can say that I wrote a chapter in my new book about love, and that's a different thing than seduction. And I was trying to come up with an idea of love that does have an element of equality, that doesn't have this power dynamic going on in it.
I love that. And,
kind of like the antithesis of my art of seduction, where I'm almost contradicting myself. And I was going into the biology of it and even into the physics of it. So there's a famous French biologist whose name escapes me. Sorry, I can't remember, from the 20s and 30s. And he was studying paramecium. And he was studying them, they're in these ponds, etc. And he said that there was these moments where these single-celled organisms were suddenly coupling. They were all joining together, just one to one, and they were absorbing the membrane of one inside the other. And then they would and then once one couple did that, all the paramecium started joining up together. Then they would sink to the bottom of the pond. And paramecium don't reproduce through sex. They reproduce through dividing themselves, right? Self-reproduction. And so he was saying that the desire to couple, to connect to someone so deeply where you absorb, one is absorbed in the other, is biologically wired into us and goes back millions of years. And it's a desire, essentially, a biological desire for love, right? And it's an energy that permeates it's not just about power and hierarchies, and that he was showing other creatures that had something similar going on. And, in physics, we talk about entanglement, and we also talk about, matter. If matter isn't opposed by a lot of kinetic energy, it joins together. Particles join together to form matter, et cetera, et cetera. So there's something in the universe that's trying to connect things to each other. So there's this kind of energy that exists in the world where we have a deep need to connect to somebody outside of those power dynamics, right? Where there's a degree of equality, where we're drawn to each other, and we let go of the ego games, we let go of the playing, we kind of surmount our own physiology, our own hypothalamus, and we engage in this, I call it love sublime. And it involves the physical part. The sexual part is the trigger for it. Because when you have sex with someone, your body is suddenly permeable to their energy in a way that you cannot control. It releases all kinds of chemicals in the brain that are very powerful. And oftentimes that sense is too powerful and you react and you're afraid of it and you pull back. But if you don't react and you go further, then the mind also becomes permeable to the other person and their energy and their desire. And so then it kind of creates a spiraling effect where the physical and the mental connection reaches this state that I call love sublime. Now, it's an ideal. It doesn't really exist that much out there in the world today, but there are stories in history that illustrate it, and I believe that it is a biological necessity for us to feel a deep, deep sense of connection. We normally ascribe that to religion, to God, etc. But I maintain the essence of love, the model for love, is between two human beings, straight or homosexual, doesn't matter. And that feeling of surmounting our own neurology, our own system, and entering this zone is deeply, deeply satisfying. We all want it. And it has to involve letting go of the power dynamics, and everything being equal. It's not that the other person is exactly like you. You recognize their difference. But as far as being worthy of attention, being worthy and respected, you leave all of that other stuff outside. So there is a zone that's possible that's outside this power dynamic that we're talking about.